In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint Tyranids in the Hive Fleet Leviathan scheme, and I'm going to use the brand new Screamer Killer model to show you how. So all the techniques I show you on this model can be used across all the other models in the range. And if you bought the Leviathan box or one of the 40k starter sets, you're going to have plenty of Tyranids, so this is exactly right for you. Let's get painting. The first thing I've done is primed all of the models using Wraithbone from Colourforge. Now, if you haven't got Colourforge where you are, just use Wraithbone from Citadel. It's exactly the same. To start with, we're going to paint all of the Carapace, and it would be rude not to use Leviathan Purple contrast paint, so that's what we're going to do. So I'm taking a fairly big brush for this, and I am being quite careful. I'm making sure that I only get this on the Carapace of the model. Don't worry about getting different tones, because we're going to paint over this in the next few steps, and those different tones are really going to add to some of the texture on the model. So just work your way around and get a nice even coat all over all of the chitin. When that's dry, we're going to take some Xereus Purple and we're going to dry brush this towards the edges of the chitin on that Carapace. So make sure you haven't got too much on your brush, and it might help to use a flat brush for this because that's the kind of strokes that we're going to need on the model. So make sure you wipe most of it off on a tissue or on a textured palette, whichever you've got. And then just brush this along the model where you want to build up some of this texture. And you can see we're starting to get some linear colours coming on top of that Leviathan Purple. That's exactly what we want as we build up this all over the model. Now, when you get to those smaller parts, it might help to use a smaller brush. So if you need to do so, that's absolutely fine. Next up, we're going to detail some of that chitin, and the colour we're going to use is Warpfiend Grey, which is a nice light grey purpley colour. So now it's really important for this step that you haven't got too much on your brush, you've got a really good tip, and that you've thinned the paint down a little bit because it will start to blend into those layers underneath. So all we're looking to do is paint sharp straight lines down the chitin, focusing on those edges of where there's no overlap. So where the overlap of the chitin is, we want that to be darker. Towards the edges, we want these nice vertical lines. All we're going to do is move fairly quickly with the brush, drawing in those vertical stripes. And one of the key things to try and do here is make sure that we're having some variation along the length of these lines. And once we've got this done over all of the chitin, that's that part done. It's time to move on to some of the other areas next. I think we'll start off with that nice kind of pinky underbelly colour. So we've probably got a lot of Tyranids we need to get through. So what I'm going to do is make up an oil wash, and the colour I'm going to use is magenta. Now I'm using Winsor & Newton, the Griffin Alkyd oil wash, and this is a fast drying oil wash, so it does mean you're going to have to move fairly quick to make sure I get stuff out of it. But let's get the wash done first, and I'll show you how we're going to do it. So I'm going to take a little bit of this and put it into a small metal tray. I'm then going to take some odorless white spirit. Now I often get asked how much white spirit I'm going to use. Most of the time it's a pipetful and that's enough, but it is one of those things you're going to have to practice and get used to, depending on the kind of oil paint you're using and how thin you want the wash. Once I've popped this in there, I'm going to mix it all together and I've got a very nice thin wash. It's time to go to the mini. Because that oil wash is fairly thin, it'll flow into the recesses of this model quite nicely. Now I'm using a synthetic brush. I think this is a Red Grass Games dry brush that I'm using here. I'm just going to dip it in the paint and then tap it on the model, and it's going to run into those recesses really nicely. Don't worry too much if it does go over bits that you want to be a lighter colour. I'll show you how to clean those in the next step. Just make sure you get this into all of those nooks and crannies, and of course all that exposed musculature that you've got on some parts of the model as well. Now, to wipe off the oil paint, and this is why it's important you move fairly quickly because this is a quicker drying oil. You don't want it to dry, so don't leave it too long in there. Give it about 10 minutes to set up, then go in and clean it off. I'm using a microfiber cloth around those really big areas, and all I'm doing is just wiping, and I'm wiping towards those recesses. That's where I wanted. If you've got any stubborn parts you can't clean, then you can do this using some of that white spirit. Now, I thought it might be fun to experiment with the oil paint a little bit and getting some blends across some of the extremities of the Tyranid. So what I've done is taken some of that magenta, popped it down at the end of the arms before the claws start, and I'm just going to blend this with a brush into that white colour that we've got. Now this is going to go a lot quicker than perhaps if you were trying to do this with glazing. Wet blending might be quicker, but I thought it was a really good chance to experiment. So all I'm doing is I'm working it back and forth as I'm really happy with the blend that I've got. Once that oil is completely dry, and again, once you've gone across your entire Tyranid force doing this and come back to the first one, it shouldn't be too far off being dry. I'm just going to take a very small dry brush and I'm going to dry brush some white paint across all of the bone areas on the model. Now, In terms of the white paint I'm using AK white, but you can use whatever bright white you prefer. Just work it around nice and easily, taking your time. And if you do need to go in and repair any areas, or if you've got too much of the magenta colour, then some Pied Witch Flesh is a really good colour for this. Next, we'll do the transition from the talons to the arms. Now, this is kind of like a browny red colour on the artwork. So what I've decided to do is take some Wyldwood contrast paint, and I'm going to paint this all over those areas. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do them one at a time. And once I've covered them with the Wyldwood contrast paint, I'm going to clean my brush off, and then I'm going to take a little bit of water, and I'm just going to brush over those areas that are there. And what that'll do, it'll just take the contrast paint off the top layers, and that'll give a little bit of highlighting to these areas. You don't have to go back in with a brush afterwards. This is nice and easy and straightforward, but it's important that you do them one at a time, because this is what will enable you to actually take that top layer off. For the talons themselves and all those sharp claws, we're firstly going to base them using Baal Red contrast paint. Now, this is a very nice vivid contrast paint that's going to give you a fairly uniform colour all over these claws. Don't worry about that, because I'm going to show you how to get that darker colour really easily in the next step. So just paint them all over with the Baal Red contrast. Once that Baal Red contrast paint is dry, and it's really important that it's dry, we're then going to add the darker colours. So we're going to take some black Templar contrast paint, and we're going to paint this all over those talons and claws. So again, like we did with that transition area, we're only going to do one at a time. So paint all of the black Templar contrast paint over it, then clean off your brush, make sure there's no more paint on it, and then using that brush, just pull it along the sharper edges of the model where you'll catch that natural sharp highlight. Now, normally we'd paint this in, but what we're doing is we're using the brush to take away the paint on top to reveal the paint underneath, and this will give us a really nice transitional highlight on here. I'll show you later how to sharpen up a little bit, but for now, this is okay. And if we're doing a whole load of Tyranids, we want okay, we want fast. For the mouth, I'm going to take some Screamer Pink. So I'm going to paint this all in the mouth, and I'm also going to paint the teeth with this as well, just to get it into that gum line, because I'll paint them white later, but I want something there that's going to separate them. And Screamer Pink's a great colour for this because it works really nicely with the mouth itself. For the eyes, we want something nice and bright and yellow. So if you haven't, then you might need to dot the pupils using some white paint, but I'm just using some Bad Moon Yellow contrast. And this is really nice because it goes into those recesses, covers over the white, and gives you a really nice glowing yellow eye. We'll paint all of the fleshy parts next, and there's quite a few around the model. If you're not sure, just check the box art. But I'm going to take some Kislev Flesh for this and just work this into those areas. Now, this should cover in one coat, but particularly if you've got some of the purple oil on there, magenta oil, then you might need a second coat. We'll then shade all of the fleshy areas using some Rekloand Felshshade. Now, we don't want this to pull too heavily in the recesses because we want these areas to be nice and bright. So just take your time and work it in there. You will need to just focus in terms of getting some of that transition between the armoured shell and the fleshy parts, though. While I'm waiting for that Rekloand Felshshade to dry, I'm going to take some titanium white from Procryl, and I'm going to use this just to paint the teeth in. So all I'm doing is just following along those model lines, leaving that Screamer Pink in the recesses, and that'll help them stand out really nicely. At this point, I think we've got a really good tabletop mini. If we painted all our force like this, it'll look great on the table. But let's kick on. Let's add some highlights just to make this big monster creature pop a little bit. We'll start with all the flesh, and the colour I'm going to use is Kislev Flesh again. And what we're looking to do is highlight those raised areas of flesh, leaving that Rekloand Felshshade in the recesses. Now, this is a fairly straightforward part, and we can go fairly quickly along this bit. Once that's done, we're going to take some Flayed One Flesh, which is a much brighter colour, and we're going to focus this along those hard edges of the fleshy parts on the model. And one thing to remember as we're doing this is that we only really need to do the top half of the model because we're not actually going to see the bottom half, and that's going to be in shadow anyway. Next up, we'll add some extra sharpness on those claws, and the colour we're going to use is Evil Sunz Scarlet. So just follow along the sharp lines on the claws themselves. Make sure you haven't got too much on your brush. I've probably got too much on my brush here doing this, so my control isn't as good as it should be. And you can just pull this along the shape of the model as well, and this will just add and enhance those red highlights to make them look a bit sharper. To finish off the sharp effect on these claws, we'll just take a little bit of Ungor Flesh, and all we're going to do with this, I've got a very small brush, is just paint this at the absolute tip in a very thin line, and again, this will just simulate the sharpness of those claws. The last thing we'll do is highlight the hoofs on the miniature, and I'm going to use a light grey for this, so I'm using Dawnstone, and this is just along those edges. Very similar to how we did the chitin earlier on very thin point on your brush. We're just painting downwards towards the floor. And once you've got all that done, the model's complete. We'll just base it and we'll have a look at it next. There we have it. This Screamer Killer is done and ready for the tabletop. For the amount of time we've put into the model, I'm really happy with how he's turned out. So don't forget, you've now got all the tools you need to paint all of your Tyranids in a Hive Fleet Leviathan scheme. If you want to do a more detailed scheme, check out this video here. Otherwise, I really appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.